Good evening and welcome to our second edition of Vanguard, Conversations with Women of Color in STEM. I cannot wait to introduce you to the group of women we have here today. They are an incredible bunch and you have to know them. So we brought them together so you could. My name is Dr. Jedidah Eisler. I am an astrophysicist by training. I study hyperactive supermassive black holes called blazars, and they are amazing. So if any of you want to study them, feel free. I'm taking applicants now. And I'm also a strong advocate for creating access for students of color in STEM. And particularly, I'm really interested in starting a more involved, in-depth conversation with women of color in STEM, an often overlooked population in our STEM community. So to that end, we're looking to talk to this illustrious panel of women about their experience, about their finding their way, which is our theme for tonight. The hope is to share specific strategic advice, but also to serve as virtual role models for those of you watching who are looking for some examples as you're trying to find your way. As I said, I am elated, just over the moon about this panel we have tonight. They are an incredible group of people, and having chat with each one of them for at least a little bit before this call, I'm telling you, they have so much wisdom to give. The hour that we have may not contain all the wisdom that we have. There's a few housekeeping tasks that I want to bring up to you before we get started. The first is that this is an interactive panel. We are going to have some conversations. I'll start us off with some questions, but we really want to hear from you. There's so much advice to give and so many experiences. And we just developed a Facebook group called Vanguard Conversations with Women of Color in STEM. So if you want to head over there to ask questions, we'll try to get to those too. This is a monthly show. It's brand new. It's our second episode. But it'll take place the first Tuesday of every month. So go ahead and mark your calendar. Every Tuesday, 7 o'clock Eastern, we will be getting together to do this because it's something that we want to have things going as we go. So the next one is September 1st, for those of you keeping track now. So as for the format of this panel, this virtual conversation, I'm going to introduce our panelists, tell you a little bit about their history. Then I'm going to ask questions for about 20 minutes. After that, I'm going to open it up to you to ask questions. So I'm pretty sure you're going to need to have some, because otherwise, who's going to ask? So please do get your questions ready. Feel free to shoot those out at any time. That way we'll have them here on deck for you when you're ready. Okay, so without further ado, please let me introduce you to this illustrious panel of women of color in STEM. First, I'll introduce Dr. Deanna Williams. She studies neuroimmunology, and in her research, she identifies the mechanisms by which HIV infection promotes neurologic disease and neurocognitive impairment. She's interested in figuring out how HIV enters into the brain, and once it's there, determining how the responses of the immune system to the virus promote inflammation and neuronal damage. Her current research bridges the scientific areas of immunology, virology, and neuroscience, and she's also interested in determining whether the events that happen during HIV infection occur in other neurocognitive and psychiatric disorders. I won't tell you about my girl crush on her research until later. Next up, there's Dr. Sabria Stooks, who works in microbiology and immunology and is also the founder of Connect with STEM, which we'll talk about in a second. Dr. Stooks fell madly in love with science upon reading The Hot Zone, a nonfiction book about the origins of the Ebola virus. Flag, we need to talk about that. Since then, she has worked in laboratories studying everything from the production of plant flavonoids to the infection model of M. tuberculosis. She recently earned her doctoral degree in biomedical sciences from the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. Her work centered on understanding the interactions between macrophages and the fungal pathogen Cryptococcus neuroformans. Outside of labs, she's actively involved in many organizations and communities that help to increase diversity and awareness in the science fields for women and underrepresented minorities. Next up is Dr. Johnny Moore Dotson, who earned a PhD in pharmacology and physiological science from St. Louis University. Her expertise is in vision neuroscience and synaptic mechanisms. Her current position is a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Arizona, where she studies the neural mechanisms of vision dysfunction in diabetic retinopathy. And lastly, but not least, is Dr. Giovanna Guerrero Medina. Dr. Guerrero Medina has a PhD in molecular and cell biology from the University of California, Berkeley, and a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras. She is the executive director of Ciencia Puerto Rico and the director of the Yale Ciencia Initiative, two projects that allow her to apply her training as a scientist and her love of mentoring and advising young people in order to increase this participation of students from diverse backgrounds in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, or STEM, as it's known. In her multifaceted role, she can be found overseeing tens of volunteers to help connect people all over the world who are interested in science and Puerto Rico with opportunities to contribute to science outreach and mentoring, managing projects that connect students with scientific role models, and helping develop science education resources that make science culturally relevant for Puerto Rican and Latino students. She sees herself as a champion for science and technology and someone who is lucky to get to help her country and her people increase their involvement in this important sector. They are impressive, I'm trying to tell you. So today we're talking about finding your way, how we found our way. And as you know, this will guide the rest of our conversation as we're thinking about our answers to the question. So let's start from the beginning. Could each of you take a minute or two to tell us where you got your bachelor's and master's degrees or any other previous degree that you had? And then at what point in that process you figured out that what you wanted to do to pursue the field you're in now? And I'll start with Johnny.
All right, wow, well, thank you for a wonderful introduction. So I did my undergraduate degree also at St. Louis University in biology. I earned a Bachelor's of Arts. I started out pre-med, but I was going through that process, and one day in my biology class, the professor asked how many people wanted to be doctors. And like 95% of the people raised their hands. I said, yeah, not so much now. Maybe that's not what I want to do. And then as I went along further in my classes, I learned I didn't think like a lot of the pre-med students thought. Like my thinking process was different. So I sought out other options, and I went and talked to the chair of our biology department, and he was like, well, maybe you should go work in a lab, which I didn't even know was a possibility until I went and talked to him. So I applied for a couple of jobs. One was in the biochemistry department, and I started out as a research tech in the biochemistry lab, and my boss there was really adamant when it was time for me to graduate that I apply for PhD programs. So I did, and I got in, and that started me on a path and ended up where I am now.
Sabrina, why don't you take out from there?
So thank you for that introduction. Sometimes I forget like how much I've done until I've had to like write it all down in these kind of like bio sketches. So when you were talking, I was like, man, I've kind of done a lot. But as you said in my intro, yeah, I started out in a plant lab at Virginia Tech, and kind of like what Johnny said, I didn't even really know being in a lab was a thing that one could do. I started out pre-med in that I thought being interesting. And then I think what happens for some people is they get to organic chemistry and physics, and I'm just like, I don't want to do this. But then I started taking classes like molecular pathogenesis and virology, and those things, I was like, man, this is really, really exciting. And my molecular biology teacher at Virginia Tech said, why don't you think about working in a lab? And she had a position in her lab, which is where I started working with the plant model Arabidopsis. I really wanted to work with infectious diseases, so that was not really what I wanted to do, but it gave me my first taste of what it was like to be in a lab, to plan experiments, to just kind of be in that lab environment. And I actually didn't even think about PhD schools until maybe 3 years after I graduated. When I graduated college, I knew that I didn't want to go to school anymore, actually, but I didn't know what I wanted to do. And so I was out of the lab for a few months, and I actually missed being in a lab. And so I applied for a fellowship at the National Institute of Health, and I was able to work in an HIV lab for a year. And then when that was done, I kind of was in the same situation of I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't really want to go to school again, but I really knew I wanted to continue to learn and to continue to be in a lab. So I moved to New York, and I did work in a TB lab for 2 years at NYU, the medical center. And then after that, I was like, okay, what is my trajectory looking like? And that's when I started thinking about grad schools. And that's how I ended up going to the Albert Einstein College of Medicine.
Giovanna.
So I think I was a little bit lucky in that one of my parents was in science. So my dad is or was a botanical chemist. So he had already talked to me about careers in biotechnology, and at least I knew what he did. So, you know, I think that definitely was, you know, was something that I had already. But I was also interested in the humanities and the arts. I was good at math, so I was actually pretty confused when I started college. I actually applied first to engineering to be a mechanical engineer and was accepted. But then I realized I actually didn't know what a mechanical engineer did. You know, I couldn't imagine what a typical day of a mechanical engineer was. So I decided to switch to biology, which is something that I thought I knew a little bit better. And I think that speaks a little bit to the importance of knowing more about, you know, STEM careers as early as possible, so that, you know, kids can visualize in those careers. And then in college, you know, I liked my biology classes. In particular, my molecular biology class. You know, I loved how something that seems so complicated as heredity, or, you know, how molecules worked inside the cells, you could actually figure out how it worked. And so I really loved that. But it wasn't until I took an advanced class in developmental biology that I realized that was where I was hooked. I was amazed that, you know, something as complex as a human being could grow out of a fertilized egg, you know, like so many decision points have to happen, and it all has to happen well. And so I was amazed by that. But I had only worked in chemistry, toxicology labs up to that point. So I realized I didn't have the background that I needed to go into a PhD in that program, and I actually did an NIH post-bac for a year to work in a developmental biology lab and get more experience. And that was a great opportunity because, you know, all the top scientists come through NIH. And so it was a great chance to see what the top scientists were doing, what schools they were coming from. And that's where I decided to pursue developmental neurobiology as a PhD.
Yeah, Deanna.
So I knew kind of early that I wanted to be in science, and my mom put me into a science high school, the Bridgeport Regional Vocational Aquaculture School, so shout out to Aqua. And that school was amazing because it introduced me to research very, very early. So I think in my sophomore year, I started doing PCR. We had UV vis specs, IR specs, mass specs, so I knew. So when I went to college at Hofstra University, I majored in biochemistry. And even though I knew I loved research, I didn't know you could actually do it for a career. I just thought it was something that you do for fun. Maybe that was pretty nerdy because maybe it wasn't fun for everyone else, but for me, I loved it. And then I started doing research my junior year of college, and then I found out that you can actually do this as a career. And then from then, I did a CERP program for a summer at UMass Med. And again, I loved it, and that was my first introduction to HIV. So when I came back from that, I was ready to apply to grad schools. And I also went to Albert Einstein College of Medicine with Sabria. And from there, reading the faculty profiles, I knew I loved HIV already, and I wanted to go more into neuroscience. And so I found my mentor, Joan Berman, who merged the two very beautifully. And so for me, it was kind of relatively easy in that I knew I liked science, but I had no idea you can do research as a career. And I think that really strengthens the fact that we need to have more awareness early on that you can do things besides being an MD. I mean, that's great, but that's not the only way to kind of get into science.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's funny because what I'm hearing from your stories, and certainly what I've seen in my own, is this idea that when we write our bios, as you say, Sabria, when we write these bios, it seems like it's just straightforward. I mean, you did this, and then you did that, and then that other thing happened. Like that's just won some awards along the way. That's what happens. But we know for sure that that's not actually what happens, right? There are all these experiences, and there are all these mentors, and that someone that tells us. I think someone should get an award, right? Because generally when you hear someone telling a success story, it's because someone told them that they should do this, or someone told them that they should do that, right? And I think that's an important theme that all of you mentioned in your stories, right? That, whether it was a parent role modeling for you, whether it was a teacher, a mentor, advisor, someone was saying, hey, have you considered this? I also found it very interesting, especially since I come from way on the other side of the tracks, that many of you started out thinking, oh, well, I'll be a doctor. And in fact, we still, that issue, I shouldn't say issue, that phenomena still persists, right? Where the first thing young students are often told is that, oh, you like science, you should be a doctor. And so I really like this idea that you can come into different experiences by recognizing that science and STEM is actually much more than just being a doctor. Anybody have any comments there?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, when you talk to kids about careers in science, usually what they think of is being a doctor. They think that's what pops up. That's what most kids are exposed to, or being an engineer. But there's so many more careers that have to involve a good knowledge of science and STEM. I think if you're just talking to kids about being in medicine or being in engineering, you're missing out on a lot of kids that might be interested in seeking out other careers that have to do with science and math. So I think that awareness of possibilities very early on is very important, not only for students to continue in these careers, but to know the importance of taking these courses early on, of getting a good base education in high school in these topics.
Yeah, and to add on to that, I feel like it's sometimes it can seem very binary, where it's like if you want to do science, you can only do doctor or engineer, and PhDs are left out. And so a lot of times with some of the work that Deanna and I used to do at Einstein, when we would go to schools like within the proximity of our institution, so many kids would say, oh, I didn't even know that someone that looked like you, who also looks like me, could be a scientist. Also, what do scientists do? And so, I enjoy talking to kids about what I do, because I don't necessarily think everyone should be a scientist. I don't think everyone should pursue a PhD, but I do think that when it comes time to think about, oh, what can I be, that career trajectory is on the table. Mm-hmm. And I think for a lot of kids right now, it's not. And so I think that conversations like this and promoting and amplifying work that we're all doing, is really going to help that.
And just to add on to that, I think the work that you all do to promote to people, say in high school or elementary school, that there are other options other than being a doctor or engineer is important. It's important to get there early, because there are actually programs for people in high school to go to labs and do research, which I didn't know about at all. And had I known, I would have done it. But I didn't know. And now, if they're getting earlier exposure to it, then they can know to be looking out for these programs when they get into high school, if it's something they think they might be interested in.
Or even, I think like one of the biggest lessons my parents taught me was that it's sometimes more important to know what you don't like than what you do like.
Absolutely.
So if you can even get into the lab as a high school and say, you know what, I'm glad I had this experience, but this isn't for me. Because then by the time you get to grad school, sometimes, it's like not the first time you've been in lab, but then you're like, wait, I really didn't know what this was about. And that's also a struggle that some people don't talk about, where it's like once you're in it, you're just like, wait, is this for me? I don't really know if I like this. So, I mean, I just think having as many experiences within the STEM field as early on as possible, you know, can only help you.
Absolutely. I think that you all mentioned some really good points that I wanted to just underline. I like this notion of, not everybody will or not everyone should be a STEM assist. That's what I like to call STEM practitioners. They won't necessarily be that. Everyone shouldn't be that. But everybody should have the option. Everybody could be that, right? That's what we're working towards, the idea that people should have the option, and the sad fact is that there are large portions of our population, particularly students of color, students that are below of a certain socioeconomic status, rural students who aren't getting these opportunities, right? Like they aren't getting the very, very firsthand early exposures that gives them the possibility that they could be that, whether or not they should or not, that they could be. And I think having those conversations and getting information out is very important. The other thing that we talked about, and it's sort of consistent in all of our stories, is this notion of experience, right? So you can't really explain what you do just in words, right? Like we can say it, and we do say it because I think the words are powerful, they have meaning, and they do bring weight to what we do. But really, you don't know that you want to do vision science until you're in the lab studying vision science, I suspect, right? That's the way that it goes. And so this notion of getting experience and exposure early, and I think that, as you say, there are two places that we need exposure. One, we need exposure to the careers, that these positions exist. This is what you can do. You don't have to just be a clinician to do this work. And number two, people who look like you exist in those roles, right? Like it's a dual impact that one has to make. And so I think that's why it's important, as you say, to go into places and to be that person. One of my favorite stories to tell is when I visit young students in their classrooms, you do the career hours or whatever. Often the young girls of color will, I'll talk about black holes, and we'll talk about how amazing they are and what you need to make one, and all this and all that. And at the end, I'll open up for questions, and invariably one young girl will say, "So how do you get your hair like that?" Right? And it's sort of, I actually really love the question. Some people get upset. They're like, I can't believe she focused on your hair. But what it is she's seeing herself in me, right? She's never seen that same package of natural hair as an astrophysicist maybe. And so she's seeing it, and then she wants to know. And so usually what I say to them is, if you'll ask me one serious science question, then I will tell you my whole hair routine. And every single time this has happened, they have asked the best questions. Right? So your points ring true to me. Now I want to sort of take a slightly different turn on this same point, the same point of finding your way, and some of you mentioned it specifically as it relates to turning from medicine and into these sort of research positions. But I want to talk about, if there are specific examples of experiences that you had that let you know what? This is not my path. I'm going to take a hard right here.
That science was not, or just something else I was doing?
So, for example, let me give you an example from my life. When I did many internships in college because I like to travel, and they tell me that they'll pay you and send you places, so I did it. But one of them was for nuclear engineering for a summer program. And I went, and it was at the bottom of a campus nuclear reactor in the middle of the summer. And so I had like 4 levels of security that I had to go through. I was in like the 3rd sub-basement, and I spent my whole summer like in a hole away from people. And what my experiment wasn't actually even all that compelling. I was sort of taking pictures of phase transitions. I found that to be not great for many reasons. Number one, because I like people and sunshine. And so for me, that was a clear example of, what, I love science. I've never wavered in that, but maybe nuclear engineering is not for me.
Yeah, so actually, a very similar experience I had. I think, Giovanna, we must have done the same post-bac program, because at NIH, after I graduated, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but, like I said, I knew I wanted to be in the lab, so I applied, I got in, and I got into an HIV lab, and because at the time, infectious diseases are my jam, I was like, this is great, I get to, suit up in, the suit and go into, the BSL-3, and I was working on genetics at the time, and it was just me and my PI in an incredibly tiny lab. And after the fellowship, I was just like, I don't think that I'm good enough for this, actually. I messed up many times. There was just kind of a relationship dynamic that I could never really get a grasp on between me and my PI. He was very smart. It was like the first time that I was kind of, it was like a first real job. I was a research tech. And I just, there were some days I would just go home and cry, or just like run into the stairwell and cry. And I was just like, this isn't it for me, because it's not fun anymore. And I had to actually take a step back, because I was like, wait, is it not fun anymore, or is this just like an experience that I'm having? And do I still think about the science when I go home? Do I still think about, like, how could I have done it better? And all of those answers were yes. I mean, I was still, reading science papers. I was still happy to go to seminars. And so I was like, this is just one step in my journey, and that doesn't necessarily mean that I shouldn't continue to do this. And so even though it wasn't the best experience for me, it was still an experience. And I still moved to New York, and I worked in another research lab, and it was a different experience.
Right. Deanna, did you want to jump in and talk about that?
Yeah, for me, I actually wanted to first be an analytical chemist and not a biologist at all. And so in college, I did research in the chemistry department as well as the biology department. And the chemistry department was really good in that I learned a ton, but it was very boring and very monotonous. And I got my work done very quickly, and my boss was really happy and proud of me. But I just knew I wasn't being challenged, and I didn't have like the spunk that I normally have when I'm doing work, and I just wasn't engaged, honestly. And I found myself not wanting to come in. And that to me was a very clear sign, okay, this is not who I am, and this is not for me. And so around the same time I was beginning to do work in the molecular biology department, and that was extremely challenging. I didn't know anything. And so I think maybe the challenge of that kind of helped to make up for what I wasn't getting in chemistry, and that kind of pushed me into biology. And then from there, immunology and then neuroimmunology. But really kind of losing my spunk and not being happy. I was like, I want to be able to me. I need to figure out what else I can do to kind of fulfill that niche.
So I had a similar experience. Oh, sorry. Did you want to go ahead?
No, go ahead, Joni.
Oh, okay. Mine will be really quick. In my graduate program, there were 5 departments that fed into this program, and you spent your first year rotating in different labs. You can do one in each of the departments, and I just knew that I was going to do pathology, and I rotated in a pathology lab, and I went to that lab expecting to be able to learn how to identify different disease states by looking at the tissues and things like that. It was nothing like that at all. It was centrifuging blood and separating out different blood components, and I can't remember what they were trying to figure out, but I wasn't happy, and it was far away from everybody else in the program because it was a lab in a hospital and all the other programs were in the medical school, and I said, nope, this is not for me, and I ended up in the pharmacology and physiology department. So
Yeah, one thing I like about all these stories is that people in science have the trajectories are never linear. I mean, there's never anybody you talk to in science that are like, I came out of the womb and I knew I was going to be studying, HIV transmission, So it takes a while to find your way, and I guess that's why we're having this conversation. So I already talked about my first career pivot, science pivot, but the other one, the other major one for me happened at the end of graduate school. So I had a really good graduate experience. I was in a great graduate program. I had a good experience in the lab. I got some publications out of it, but I started to see that that all the people that I really admired in science, they were struggling to find positions. Like the postdocs that I admired the most, were having to extend their postdoc, or were applying and not getting their positions. And so that started worrying me, and it started also making me think whether I, would be able to succeed in such a competitive environment. And at the same time, I was also realizing that my love for science, was pretty broad. I like knowing how things work. In general, I like attacking problems, but I don't necessarily like getting focused on one particular issue. And that's something specific to me. And like, you know, we've been talking about, as you're going through the process, you're learning about yourself. So, you know, that's something I learned through graduate school. And so I decided that I love science and I wanted to support it, but I didn't want to actually be doing it. So I did a science policy fellowship at the National Academies. And I really liked, you know, the idea of working in a sector where you're helping scientists do what they do best, helping students get into these interesting careers. And then that's when I found, by chance, Ciencia Puerto Rico. So this postdoc from Puerto Rico had just started it about less than a year that I found it, and I can't remember what I was Googling, and I happened on it. And that's where it kind of clicked for me, where, you know, I was in a program where I was training to work in making the scientific environment better, in making a better ecosystem for science. And here was a way to actually applying it to the place where I was from and the, you know, the people that I grew up with. And so that's where I decided that, you know, that was going to be my next career, was working kind of in the sidelines or behind the scenes to help Puerto Rico and Latinos and Hispanics in science move ahead and have better opportunities in that sector.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to come back to that because I want to talk specifically about the work that you and Sabria are doing in the sort of engagement community. But I wanted to underline some of the things that you said and then try to adjust them to the lens of being a woman of color in STEM. So one of the things that you mentioned, and I sort of wrote down, you know, the connection between expectations and experiences, right? Giovanna, you mentioned this specifically when you were talking about, you know, people expect science to be a linear path. I mentioned that earlier. You know, we read the bio and it sounds like roses, the whole thing. But in principle, it's not. We have, you know, we go in a direction and then there's a wall there, pivot, or there's a wall there, got to jump over it, or there's a wall there, got to tear it down. You know, there are all these things that happen and different fits and starts as we go along the way. And so, you know, the expectation of what we think STEM is versus what it actually, our experience of it is, I think, is often different. And I think that's different for anyone. It doesn't matter who you are, what your identity is. But the question is, do you feel any more or less pressure to compare the expectation to your experience as a woman of color? And before you answer, so I'll give you a chance to think about that, let me just say to our viewing audience that your time for asking questions is coming up shortly. But if they don't pop up on my screen, I'm totes going to keep asking my own questions. Did I use the word totes? Wow. Anyway, if you don't ask questions, I'll keep asking questions. So now's your time to chime in either in the Q&A box on your screen, through Twitter on the hashtag VanguardSTEM, on the Google comment section, in Facebook, wherever you like. Just feel free to start getting those questions ready so that we can have them for our panelists. Now, please feel free to answer.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, I think that's, well, first to your question of, you know, and what also Giovanna said about it's not linear, but I also feel like a lot of times when we talk about what we've done, it's like, not that people don't want to hear that we've struggled, but it's like, I know every one of us on this panel has struggled. It's not like, oh, I got this NIH fellowship for a year and then it was great and then I moved to New York and I did 2 years. I mean, I feel like now maybe if I write bio sketches, I'm just going to like put all my struggles and like successes at the same time, because it's, I mean, it almost seems a little idealistic to just be like, oh, everything worked out and everything was fine. But to your question, you know, it has been a struggle for me because I don't actually work in a lab anymore, and I don't think I ever made the conscious decision to not work in a lab. I just was like, I'm not sure if working in a lab is where I will have the most impact. And I think I really struggled with that because as a woman of color, and also as in talking to these kids about what I do, not that I feel like I have to be the one that carries the torch for all women of color in science, but I feel like if I take my torch away from academia, then the light dims just a little bit. And so I had to really struggle with like, okay, you know, people see me, and I represent myself as a woman of color in STEM, doing science, doing research, like at the bench. And academia just kind of is not a place, I think. Like, I mean, I still don't know yet, but it was really a struggle for me because I feel like people expected me to stay because they're like, well, now that you're there, you did this thing, you got your PhD. If you walk away, then what kind of message does that send to everyone else? And so, when I think I've had this very similar conversation with Deanna, in hallways and at our lab benches, where it's just like, there is a little bit of pressure. And Deanna, I don't know how it is, now. I'm actually so glad that you're still in research.
Yeah, for me it was interesting, I guess, because I'm the first in my family to go to college and finish in 4 years. People went and then they dropped out, things like that. So for me, everything is new, right? I didn't really have many people to look up to, and in some ways it was good because I didn't have much pressure. My family was like, "You're great, no matter what I did." Like, I really couldn't mess up, honestly. And focus on. And it was difficult because, like Sabria said, a lot of people kind of push academia, and it just so happened that I was very good at the things that are looked for in academic positions. I had a lot of papers in grad school. I got every fellowship I applied for. I won awards like all the time. And for me, it was like, okay, we'll go into academia. But I really didn't know at first that was what I wanted to do. So now I'm a postdoc at Johns Hopkins. I've been there for about a year. And in this year, I've kind of concluded, like, yes, academia is for me, because I really want to be able to work on what I want to work on because it's interesting and important to me, and use that kind of as my platform to advocate for science or for women of color in STEM, or anyone in STEM, but particularly women of color in STEM. Because in grad school, I did a lot of outreach, and I still continue to do it, and it's something that I think fulfills me and motivates me and gives me something that's different than just doing the research can in and of itself. But I feel like if I weren't doing the research, I would miss it terribly. So for me, academia came to be a good fit, but honestly, I figured it out in the last 6 months.
So,
Figure it out at the moment you need it. Johnny, please. Sorry.
oh, sorry. So, for me, I do feel that pressure to kind of carry the torch, and I think I feel it more now in the field that I'm in because there's no one like me in my field at all. I've been to the meetings now. I've been working in this area for 4 years, and every time I go to the meetings, there's nobody. Everybody in our field, they know each other. You don't see a black woman. You very rarely see a black woman who does the type of experiments that I do. So I do feel that pressure, but I will say that I don't feel it enough that I can't walk away if I need to, because I did actually walk away from the lab once. This is my second postdoc. I did one postdoc that was really short, and it didn't work out, and I walked away, and I taught for 2 years at a community college because I didn't think that this was for me, and I didn't think I was good enough, to be honest. But I have a support system, and I found that the support system is kind of what has gotten me through and got me back into the lab. And the support system is what's helping to keep me in the lab in part. But also just having my confidence that I'm good enough to work through it. But if it ever gets to the point where I don't love it, I tell people all this all the time. If you fall out of love with research, you got to stop, because nothing good will come of it. So if I ever get to that point, I can walk away. And I know I can walk away. And I remember there's another woman of color. She's actually, I think, of Asian descent that I talked to. I kind of look at her as a mentor. She's young, just started her PI position in California. And she says to me one day, she says, I'm just going to try it. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But I'm going to give it all I got. And that's the philosophy that I'm taking with me. That's why I'm still here. That's why I'm going to keep going. I'm going to try it. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. It doesn't mean I'm a failure, but it just means that wasn't for me.
Yeah, that's why I feel these conversations are so important. We put so much, I think, as women of color in a sector where we're severely underrepresented, we put so much pressure on ourselves to be, you know, a certain way, or to do it not, you know, just for ourselves, but also for our communities. And I feel that having these conversations, these candid conversations, helps us realize that it's not just ourselves. I think many times we internalize all these conflicts, all these insecurities, all these struggles, and we think it's just us. I think that having the ability to see that other people have, you know, are going through that, have gone through that, hearing about how they've dealt with it, what type of decisions they've come up with, it's really helpful in parsing out your own feelings about, you know, about your career, your future. I think one of the colleagues here mentioned, you know, no decision is a bad decision, right? We shouldn't feel that what we want to do, what we end up doing, is betrayal of some, you know, standard that we had for ourselves or our communities. And I think the other important thing is that we can all contribute to our communities in many different ways, in science, outside of science. I think that there's also a lot of conflict there in terms of what people expect. You know, if you're going to be a scientist, you have to dedicate yourself solely to your research, and you're not going to be able to really do outreach. That's not, you know, it's not necessarily true. Now that I've been in this space of science outreach, I've gotten to know a lot of scientists who are very involved in science outreach and have made it work, have made their research work with their, you know, with connecting with students and with kids and making a difference. And I've also met a lot of people in the science outreach sector that are still inspiration for kids who want to go into these careers. You know, I have a whole roster of people that I can, you know, get inspiration and get these insights from. So that's I think the power of connecting, of these networks, is being able to hear these stories and helping you make sense of your own feelings and decisions.
Absolutely. There's so much here. You gave so many really good points, and I know I said I'd take some audience questions, but I just wanted to get into some of these things a little bit deeper before I do. The first I wanted to talk about and underline was this notion of the burden, or bearing the light, or, you know, how we serve our community. Often we feel, you know, I think generally, it's not universally true, but generally, people from marginalized groups often do feel a sense of, okay, you know, I want to do this for me, primarily, honestly. I want to do it for me because I think astrophysics is really interesting. I actually really think black holes are the coolest thing in the universe. Like, honestly, I do. But I also carry the blessing of being a black woman and a woman of color, and I want to make sure that other young women of color get the opportunity and are able to see this field as well. So there is a sort of dual nature to what we do, and I think the important part, Johnny, you said this, is that it's recognizing that it exists, but not allowing it to overtake our sense of ourselves and our sense of what we want to do, right? Because research it's tricky. It's tricky, and it's involved, and it's nuanced, and sometimes it behaves and sometimes it doesn't, right? And so dealing with that is enough, and then also dealing with or trying to engage the communities that we're interested in is also important. On the flip side, there's the notion that, you know, I remember when I was in graduate school and I was trying to do this, you know, dual thing. I was going to be a scientist, but I was also going to do engagement. I remember I got a lot of side eyes, a lot of people saying, I don't know, you really need to focus on your work, and sort of pushing through that to a place that was important for me, because it's not optional, right? Like, it's not optional that I do these other things. They are a part of my essence. They're a part of my person. They're a part of my humanity, and they're a part of what I view as my calling on the planet, right? And so it was never an option that I would just let it go. So, you know, there is really rich ground there, and we may have to have a whole session just on that, about the burden versus the sort of work that we do. The other thing that I wanted to underline that I think is very important is the variation of experiences, both of women of color in STEM, that's those of us that are on this call and those of us that are listening in or who will watch it tomorrow or sometime in the future, is that, I personally really like the nomenclature of women of color in STEM because it gives me a community that I can identify with, that I really enjoy that. But at the same time, we have to be careful and guard against the notion, and it's less us than more people looking at us, that we are all the same, right? We all have varied experiences. We all have different experiences. And Deanna, I really like what you said about, you just happen to be really good at doing the academics, and so it's like, hey, well, I'm good at this, so I'm going to keep doing it. It really didn't have anything to do with anything except being gifted in this work. But yeah, I think having these conversations and pointing out the diversity of experiences is very important. And I say I really shouldn't use the word diversity because it's charged. What I mean is the sort of large variation in what people can do. The other thing that you said, I think it was Johnny said it, this notion of, if it's not fun anymore, I'm going to leave. There's so much more freedom in that simple phrase than I think we often recognize. Like the confidence that it takes to say, I'm not worried, I'm not going to continue to do something I don't want to do because of someone else's expectations. That is an incredible gift. So I wanted to underline that. The next set of questions, let me just check and make sure I'm not cutting anybody off. Let me ask this question, and I will come back to a question that I have. This question is on Twitter. It's from Passe Vivant. He's wondering how men of color in academia, but not in positions of power, can support women of color in STEM.
That's a great question, and I'm so glad that somebody asked it. I think, how can men support women of color in STEM? There's a lot of different situations where you might be able to help. There's obviously overt situations where something happens where you notice that there might be some unconscious bias or conscious bias showing up. I think it's very important for people to step up, and be advocates, be friends, be decent human beings, and just point out when that happens. I think a lot of times people don't realize that their environment, their baggage, their whatever is coloring what they're saying, or it's affecting what they're saying, and that it might have some consequences. And so sometimes people have to be reminded about that. So that's one way that I think anybody can be an ally.
Yeah, I mean, and I think too that this is something that Johnny had said, and also just like the word of support. I mean, and creating a support network to help you through these times, because you can't do this alone. But also, there are a lot of times when I would talk to my friends, both male and female, about issues that I was having, and it's not that I was actually talking to them so that they could solve the problem, but it was just that so that they could be a sounding board. So I would say, if you have a friend or a woman of color in your field who comes to you and says, like, hey, I'm having this problem with my PI, maybe, ask them, how can I help you? Do you, like, what do you need from me to help you through this? Is it just like you need an ear for someone, to listen to? But also maybe then think about how you as a male move through this field as well. And it's like, how can I also, so that, like what Giovanna was saying about, the biases and things like that, like you notice it when it happens to you, or, how can I not correct other people, but see that this is an actual problem.
Yeah, and I was just going to follow up saying advocate for the women that that are in STEM. I have a circle of about 4 men of color that work with me at Hopkins in various capacities, and they've kind of become my road dogs in this postdoc. more so than I expected, and they've been really phenomenal in, one, understanding how women and men are different and how we address things differently. Sometimes I kind of like to be behind, well, mostly I like to be behind the scenes, just kind of do my thing, but they're good in encouraging me to be more in the light sometimes. And also they really advocate for on my behalf for other people, and I think that's really helpful because I think sometimes women aren't always the best at saying, look, I'm really great, I'm fantastic. And men,
Yeah.
if I'm going to urge on being stereotypical, seem to like to say that they're great, even if perhaps they might not be that great. And they've been really helpful in me learning how to do those things for myself, but it's also nice to have someone else kind of pat you on the back, particularly in higher ups, things like that, and helping me get different speaking engagements and things like that. So just really being supportive and understanding how maybe perhaps women can be different than men in different settings.
Absolutely, and I'll just throw in here and say, you know, having a conversation with women of color in STEM, it was particularly important, I felt, in this period that we're in because women of color fall at the intersection of identity. That's a sort of psychological term that we talk about how we carry multiple identities. So we have a race and a gender that sort of interact with each other, and that creates a special cocktail of experiences that neither white women, which is our standard default when we talk about women, or men when we talk about race, when we talk about Latino, when we talk about Black, we generally initially think about men. So the reason why we started this conversation is to really think about, well, what does it mean to be both, for example, Black and a woman, right? What does that mean? Recent research came out that showed in, I think it was earlier this summer, that 100% of something like 650 women of color surveyed said that they had been mistaken for the janitor on their campus, right? It's a different engagement with the society that we live in. So, when we think about how we can support one another, what we can do is, as we've talked about, we can advocate for one another. We can be there for one another, and we can create environments. I like this idea of your role dogs, right? Like we can create environments that are conducive to both of our betterment and both of our support, and sort of pool resources where we can. I'm actually thinking about pooling privilege, right? Like pooling privilege where we can, in order to make inroads for all of us. So I think that there are things that men of color in particular can do, because there are some axes on which we do often identify. And I think more broadly, when we're talking about advocating for different marginalized groups, often, honestly, the first thing that one can do to be helpful is listen, right? I think doing is great, but listening is pretty active itself. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying the whole, like, I don't necessarily need you to fix my problem. I just need you to hear that it is a problem and work with me on that.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right, so we have a few minutes before we close. So what I wanted to do was ask Sabria and Giovanna in particular if you'll each spend maybe 2 minutes and tell us about the pivot you took and the other engagements that you're doing, be it Ciencia PR, Ciencia at Yale, I might have gotten that wrong, and Connect with STEM. So give us, for each of you, just spend 2 minutes to telling us about these initiatives and how people can be in touch with you about them.
Sabria, do you want to go first? Oh, I'll go. For the past almost 9 years, I've been involved with an organization called Ciencia Puerto Rico, which means Science Puerto Rico. It's a nonprofit that really provides a space for anybody that has an interest in science or more generally in STEM and Puerto Rico to come together. So you don't have to be necessarily Puerto Rican or be in Puerto Rico. You just have to have an affinity, an interest in those topics, and really an interest in improving the sector for Puerto Ricans in Puerto Rico or abroad. And so over the years, this community has grown to almost 7,000 scientists. There's students that are interested in STEM careers. There's educators. And it's a really good group, number one, to find all these role models, people that can serve as as visions of what students could be. They can also be advisors or potential mentors for students that are coming up. And we also use the community, we leverage the community to improve science communication and science outreach. So all these are people that have an interest in science, that are experts in many different fields, and so we work with them to help improve science communication efforts in Puerto Rico to make science more accessible to the public, more culturally relevant. You know, we work a lot with media outlets in Puerto Rico, and scientists write and contribute stories. We have a couple of editors that are great science communicators and science outreach people, and can help edit the stories so that they're highlighting the relevance of new discoveries to Puerto Rican lives, or that illustrate science concepts with aspects from our culture, our society. And we do a lot of the things that we're doing here, like providing information. You know, like we said, that's the number one step, like gate that you have to cross. You have to be able to have access to information in order to be, you know, to consider going into these careers. So we do a lot of that, and we also connect with stories, with real life scientists and engineers, and their stories, and we try to highlight not just successes in science, but also challenges and how people have overcome them, because as we've talked about, that's, you know, it's really important to give full-fledged stories to students. So that's what I've been doing for the past 9 years, sometimes as a volunteer, and in the last few years I've been working full-time with this project. And now the project is at Yale, so it's based at Yale, and we're hoping to study the projects that Ciencia Puerto Rico has to see how these are having an impact. So Yale brings kind of the scholarship part and a lot of great resources.
Great, thanks. Yeah. Sabria, you're up. Got maybe 2 minutes. Sabria, you are muted. We can't.
Yeah, okay, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure of my background. So wait, you're asking me to talk about the Connect with STEM, right?
Could you give us maybe a minute or two about what Connect with STEM is?
Yeah, so as we had mentioned earlier, you know, I really feel very strongly that the sooner you introduce kids to the idea that they could be a scientist if they wanted to be, just to kind of get that, you know, tucked away in their mind, the better. And with some of the work that I was doing with the Einstein Minority Scientists Association, which was a group that was started at Einstein to go around and engage students and just to show them, like, hey, you know, you can be a scientist if you want to. I met a gentleman who was doing something similar at a high school in the Bronx, where he basically, throughout the course of the school year, video conferenced in scientists and people working in the STEM field. You know, so we had like a NASA person, we had someone from CERN. We just had he had created this way to introduce scientists, not just scientists as a career, but a variety of people who were doing these careers to the students. And I mean, they absolutely loved it. And so he was doing it for about 2 years. The teacher said that the kids were really excited about it, and that, you know, because of that, they had introduced more science classes at the school. And so he wanted a way to kind of expand this program. So I partnered with him, and we created Connect with STEM. And the model behind that is we pair one person with a school who has a really rich network of STEM professionals. And so right now we have 8 schools in the New York City area. This is the first year we're doing it. So we have 8 schools, we have 8 connectors, and they basically are working with the schools and working with the science teachers to coordinate a program of STEM that they will either video conference STEM professionals in or have them come into the school and just talk to the kids about their journey and how they got to where they are at today. All the teachers seem really excited about it. They said that the students always talk about how can they do more in science, or how can they learn more in science. And so we think that this is a really, really great way to kind of put a face on who's doing science. So like we mentioned earlier in this conversation, that if they decide that this is something that they want to do, they can say, I've seen someone do it. I mean, I do think the whole concept of see it, be it is really important, even though I think, like we all said, we didn't necessarily see anyone like us doing it. We just did it anyway. Yeah. So we're really excited to see how this program goes for the first time this year.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. I know Johnny and Deanna, you've also been working on these things, but I wanted to make sure we got those programs out. We have gotten to the end. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Drs. Williams, Guerrero, Medina, Moore, Dotson, and Stooks for joining us for this very important and super informative conversation. You can continue the conversation over on Twitter at #VanguardSTEM or on Facebook in the group where our panelists have agreed to hang out for a week. So if you have questions that you didn't ask today, please feel free to ask them there on Facebook. Just search for Vanguard Conversations with Women of Color in STEM. Thanks again so much for watching. We'll see you September 1st, next first Tuesday of the month, for our next edition. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Jedidah.
Thanks for having us.